What's up, guys? David here, your host of the Business with the Boyz podcast, and as always, joined with my co-host, Landon Troyer. Landon, this was one that we had been looking forward to for a while. We had some Wi-Fi issues when we first went to do it, and we're like chomping at the bit, like wanting to hear his story. I'm glad that we finally got this one in the books.
Yeah, for sure. Obviously, knowing where you and I both stand as big enthusiasts of individuals in the military, especially SEAL team wise, I know I personally was real antsy to hear Eric's story for sure.
Yeah, and it was before we get into some more detail and teasers. Big thank you to Dan Allison for making this intro. Dan was our very first guest on the podcast and a good friend of Landon and I's, and this wouldn't happen if it wasn't for Dan making the intro. And we'll save it for the actual podcast, but Eric also shared a story that Dan had shared with us too about the first time they met, and it's pretty interesting. Also, kind of pretty scary when you think about it. The level of intuition, from a dog. But I'll leave it at that. But what were Landon some of your takeaways? We went into his military background, but also his business background as well, and the level of acumen and success he's had, since transitioning from the day-to-day inside the military to the business world is just impressive. What were some of the things that resonated with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing for me was just, the reality when you hear it from somebody who's lived it. My best friend growing up, and still to this day, he was in the army and watching him kind of transition from doing two tours in Iraq and Afghanistan into quote unquote normal life, and then hearing Eric's story on it, that shit is real, right? And it's tough for a lot of these guys. They've seen stuff that no humans aren't, quite frankly, hardwired to see, live through stuff that, nobody should have to witness. And then it's, basically your service is done. And then it's like, all right, go figure it out. Right. And that's crazy, when your whole identity talks about is being wrapped up in being a SEAL. He even made the comment of, I was a SEAL first, then I was a husband, then I was a father, and then all of a sudden that's gone. And you just have to kind of go figure out what's next. That was nuts to me. But then, I think the good takeaways from it are that these guys are trained and developed in a way that it's survive and adapt, right? And so when you get into the business world, for him, it was kind of like, all right, well, I can either sit here and pout about it, or I can translate these skills into knowledge and go build something. And so that's been fun to watch and hear his story on how he's done that as well. So, it sounds like he's just a little bit like myself. If he wants to learn something, he just dives in and absorbs every piece of information that he can. And the guy's an absolute stud for sure.
Yeah, and a little teaser for you. We talked towards the end of the podcast about doing a part two because we spent a lot of time on his military background and still hit on his business experience, but there's a lot more that we can dive into there. So this is probably not the last time you'll be hearing Eric's story. And before we properly introduce him and dive in, just big shout out and thank you to our sponsor, Landjet. If you're in Omaha, Nebraska, or Des Moines, Iowa, they have an insane deal for our listeners. And for those of you who may not know, they're basically, balling, modded out sprinter vans that you can, take to meetings, to airports, to events, get some guys together, some gals together, family together. And the deal that they have exclusively for our listeners, if you go ahead and reach out to Rachel at landjet.com, is a $0 base rate. And then basically $2 a mile, $2.10 to be exact. And you'd be hard pressed when you do out the math to find an Uber that costs that amount. So would highly encourage you to ride in style, mention business with the boys when you do reach out. But let's get back into Eric. So Eric's proper bio that he shared with us is he is a believer, in which we talk about during our podcast, a husband, father, family man, consultant, and Navy SEAL combat veteran. And it's interesting, Landon, how previously Navy SEAL came first and everything else came after that. And since focusing on his life post military, it's become last. So it's interesting to see that dichotomy. And
I like the order of this one a little better, though. I'll be honest. I think he's got it now.
Yeah, 100%. And he also shared a quote with us, which really resonates with me, which is pray hard, work hard, play hard. You only get to go once. So on that note, let's get into the episode.
Whoa. Who knew I would make it this far? They hated, they never believe me. Yeah, I would never drop the ball. I know I make it look easy. Yeah, Mayweather with the defense. I don't care what a critic got to say. I got them picking up the pieces. That mean you really playing with your life. I'm about to come and run it all back.
Well, Eric, welcome to the show. And I want to just put a special shout out and thank you to actually our first guest and dear friend who Landon just had dinner with last night, Dan Allison, for making the intro. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for him. So Eric, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to be here.
How bridge the gap? How did you and Dan come to meet?
So Dan was a neighbor of my brother in a neighborhood here in Omaha. And my brother had talked a bunch about him, and like, it's a funny story. I think we finally met. At the time, I wasn't in Omaha yet. I lived in Denver. And finally, I was at my brother's house and we walked over to Dan's house. I literally think it was to watch like a Floyd Mayweather fight or something. And like, I went over to meet him, and how Dan is, like, just awesome.
Hey,
but
yeah. Genuine, wants to get to know your whole life story in the first
right
5
away.
minutes. Like, yep. Love
But the funny thing was that, and he talks about this still, like, he had a dog at the time, and the dog like immediately hated me. Like, I don't know why. And Dan was like, my dog can tell that you're a Navy SEAL or something. Like, he kept saying, like, he can tell you're dangerous or something like that. So you know how Dan like gets very excited. But
yes.
Yeah. No, and now we've moved to Omaha since then, and we see Dan and his wife Andrea a fair bit when we can. So yeah.
Well, it's funny that you
great people.
It's funny that you share that story. I wasn't gonna bring it up, but when Dan first made the introduction, he shared that it was like, it's the oddest thing. My dog loves absolutely everyone. And as soon as Eric came to the door, kind of like cowered away and was fearful and just like knew of his experience in the SEALs, and that he's and he said he's a dangerous motherfucker.
Yeah. I just laugh because Dan, like, as I think he tells everyone that story. So
oh yeah. Like,
I
so
guess
we got it right off the bat.
Awesome.
Yeah, we got it right off the bat.
That's
I gotta wonder. I love Dan so much, but if your brother was his neighbor, I'm wondering how many times he got called over there for basic household tasks.
Oh yeah.
Because
oh yeah, knows right away.
I don't know how many he did. I just know Dan, like, we all have skills. I'm like, I'm no like Mr. Fix It. I can do basic stuff. Like,
yeah.
We have a light pole that got knocked over, and I could fix that and rewire a light and the ceiling fan and outlets, and like, I can do a little bit of stuff. But I'm by no means
a contractor.
Yeah. Like, there's a lot of stuff I'll just have people over to fix it. Like, I could figure out how to fix my roof, but it might take me like 6 months, right? So I'll just bring someone over. But yeah, Dan, I haven't, I don't know this to be true, but I would guess like his best tool is his his credit
Cell
card.
phone. Yeah, it's credit card and his cell phone.
Well,
And,
that's
and
the
we're not
thing
saying
is
anything
he's
Dan wouldn't say either. I mean, he
Yeah,
calls
yeah.
me, and I'm like, Dan, like, you don't need to hire somebody for this. I'll swing by. It'll literally take me 5 minutes, like and I love that
but
Dan knows what Dan is.
he's
Yeah.
worked his ass off to build great relationships
Yeah.
so
Oh,
people
yeah.
will help,
Yeah.
and he's worked his butt off to make a ton of money, so when in doubt he can
Hey,
hire someone. So
I
more
would
power to him.
I would trade a portion of my handiness to have his skill set to make,
Yep.
make relationships and make a ton of money. So I'm not saying I'm any better.
Amen. With
I
you
would
on that.
definitely forego some of my handyman skills to be as successful as Dan has been. So Dan, we're not making fun of you.
We love you,
Love
Dan.
you, brother.
Well, let's rock and roll. So Eric, walk us through. So you were in the Navy, if I'm not mistaken, based on my notes, for 12 years and made it to the Navy SEALs specifically.
Yep.
What got you into the military in the first place?
Yeah, I guess I don't know. I think it all started like in junior high when that was around the time the Charlie Sheen movie Navy SEALs came out, right? Um, and I don't know, I watched that movie and it was kind of on my radar at that point, oh, this is wild. I've never heard of the Navy SEALs. And, it's a funny movie, but there's some parts in it that are, at the time were really cool. And, my brother and I, we grew up watching G.I. Joe and, of course, Rambo and Commando, kids of the 80s watching these movies. So there's always kind of like, there's always a part of me that, like, I don't know, like that idea. And then once in a while, like you'd see kind of a random, maybe a Discovery Channel show or even like an article in Newsweek about, oh, there's this team, it's the Navy SEALs, it's the hardest training in the military, right? Like that's how it was sold. But then I went into high school, and in high school, I had no interest in the military at all. I wanted to be a football player. That was like, you could call it my religion at the time. And so I was all in on football, middle school and high school. Like, just that's all I really cared about. I mean, I got grades so that I could get grades, but I wanted to play football and lift weights. That was it. And then I did go to college for a year and kind of realized, God didn't make me big enough, fast enough, strong enough, or good enough to play football. And I was playing with combination of some Division 1 talent and some Division 2 and 3 talent. And I was just like, whoa, I'm kind of wasting my time here. Like, I'm really not sure this. I know for sure there's no amount of the desire is the number one thing you need to be successful, but there was no amount of desire that was gonna make me that big, right? So anyway, watching a movie at some point in college, in the first semester, end of the first semester, and we're watching a movie about SEALs. And then, I maybe had 2 or 3 natural lights or something like that,
Just 2 or 3
or
Yeah.
more. And I don't know, I had this light bulb go off, and we're in the dorm room and this light bulb just goes off like, oh, you should become a Navy SEAL. And I always kind of had a chip on my shoulder or something to prove, all that, like all of us do. And yeah, I just kind of stood up and I said, hey, like we're in the middle of watching this movie. I'm like, and I stand up like, I'm joining the Navy. I'm going to become a Navy SEAL. And then someone in the room, actually it was one of my friends, his girlfriend said, kind of like, well, you could never do it. My ex-boyfriend was a Marine and he's bigger and faster and stronger, all these things, right? And I was
Challenge
like,
accepted.
that's all I needed was one doubter. Like,
Yep.
so I had one doubter, and you know, I enlisted in the Navy the next day. And
Wow.
so basically, this is kind of before Christmas at college. But I
It's good to know
joined,
you thought on it though.
yeah,
Put plenty
well,
of
I
thought
did.
into it. Yeah.
So, and I mean, the misconception, I didn't fly out the next day, right? I
Yeah.
did, it was called the delayed entry program. And basically, I enlisted in the Navy under the delayed entry program with a shot to try out for becoming a Navy SEAL. And then I did finish my first year of college. So I came back second semester. I finished that year. I trained hard all summer. And then I went away that fall because I wanted to spend as much time as possible, like getting in really, really good kind of endurance shape. Because at the time I was in football shape, you
Yeah,
know,
those are
like
different.
different, you're a
A
different
little
athlete.
bulkier, little
Yeah,
bulkier at
yeah.
football weight than you are at endurance weight.
Yeah, I was like 215 pounds, right? I'm like
Yep.
180 now.
Yep.
So, long story short, you know, the coolest thing though, like one of the things that stuck with me the most during that time was you know, the one person who said I couldn't do it, which I needed that fuel. And then when I told my parents, you know, we go home on Christmas break and I'm telling my parents, like, Mom, Dad, I'm gonna finish 1 year of college and then go to the Navy and become a SEAL. And you know, I didn't know how to tell them, but I knew I had to.
Yeah, this one you
Um,
just rip the Band-Aid off.
yeah, so I told them, like, we were at my grandparents' house for like a Christmas dinner, and I told them like right before it, you know, kind of hit them with it. And then my dad he just goes, you know, he didn't say anything at first, but then he just goes, huh. It's like, well, I think you'd be really good at that. And like in that moment, like just the encouragement I got, like, you know, from him. And dad was hard on us, right? Like I grew up on a farm. We worked really hard. There were days on the farm that were harder than some of the days in SEAL training, right? And the farm really helped me get ready for that. But you know, in that moment, like that just that I don't know, it was like very consequential moment to me. I'll never forget it. I talk about it all the time. Like I do some speaking from time to time, and I mention that often, especially to parents, right? Like you want to parent hard, but there are those moments where, you know, the right amount of encouragement, like that made all the difference, right? And assuming I didn't get, you know, hurt or I didn't, you know, whatever happened in training, like there was no way I would ever quit.
But yeah, now that your
Given that.
dad has kind of gave you that pat on the back, it's like, well, shit. Now I got to go through with this, right?
Yep. Yep.
Have you
So it was really, really cool. And I
have
remember it.
have you come across Patrick Bet David at all yet? So
I just dropped my son off at college, and I was listening to one of his podcasts. I've started listening to more of them, and the whole valuetainment stuff, and very cool stuff so far. Sorry to interrupt you.
no, you're good. I was just getting up to grab his book. It's called, I don't know if you've read it yet. It's called Choose Your Enemies Wisely.
No,
And
I'm gonna have to get
it's
that.
it's fire. And you know, it's very interesting because I hear him talking about this and hear him talking about or talking to successful people, you know, whatever your definition of success is, but he's noticed that they have a couple common experiences in their life.
Uh-huh.
And it's interesting how you just confirm that to continue to be true, which is you have someone, it doesn't matter if you have a close relationship with them or if it's
Right.
just in passing, like a buddy's girlfriend that maybe you don't even, you know, interact with anymore, who just said you can't do
I forget
it.
her name. Yeah, I forget her name.
Exactly.
Yep.
Right. So, you know, you have someone who, you know, doubted you and you have an inspirational moment to prove them wrong and you're determined to do so. But then you also have someone in your life, which in this instance, based on what you shared, you know, was your father, which is unconditional love and support and encouragement, and having sort of that dichotomy between the two is amazing fuel to be successful in whatever you're pursuing. So it's just interesting that you basically just confirm that in real life. But yeah, I'd highly recommend checking out his book, Choose Your Enemies Wisely by
I'll get
Patrick
it.
Bet-David.
I mean,
I'll
it's
get
the
that.
whole
I'll get
goes
that for
back
sure.
to goes back to the movie thing, right? You need a protagonist and you need an antagonist. You need a doubter and you need somebody you respect saying, yeah, go do it.
I think, I don't know if is the word paradox or paradigm or whatever, but I think, there's a balance, right? Like, no matter what the trait is or whatever the thing you're talking about, like fear can be a good thing or a bad thing, right? Like, depending, and it's like that razor's edge you walk.
Paralyzer or a motivator.
Exactly. There's been times in my life where fear either kept me alive, or the fear of falling, kept me alive. It made me, like, I don't know, be very detail oriented on packing a parachute, or like I climbed El Cap, right? And that fear of falling made me made me spend the time necessary to tie good knots and whatever, right? But then also there's, like, I think fear of failure is probably a better example. So I've had fear of failure, everyone does, but hold me back from trying something new, and kind of like make you paralyzed. But I've also had a fear of failure motivate me to be better, right? Especially in the SEAL teams. Like, when you fail there, a mission fails, a teammate gets injured or killed, or it's really bad, right? So that fear of failure basically drives you to be the best operator you can be and show up the best person you can be on that team, right? So it kind of drives you forward, and even gets to the point, like, you're more afraid of failing in that moment and letting the guy to your right or left down than you are of getting injured or killed yourself, right? So I think, like, that's one of those things. You have, like, the point you just made, having a doubter, but you can't have everyone doubt you. Like, that just, you just get too beat up. And then having a supporter, but you can't have everyone support you and get a trophy for,
And you'll be delusional.
cooking dinner or something, right? Like, you can't, like, so I think everything kind of exists on that kind of continuum, right? Like, where it's, if you too much on this side, you fall that way. Too much on that side, you fall that way. So anyway, sorry for the
It's
ramble.
interesting. No, it's interesting perspective as well. I know I've experienced this, and a lot of folks listening to this, I'd imagine Landon has experienced this, which is the fear of failure, which is really comes down to a couple main things. One is the fear of being judged based on what you do, as well as the fear of, like, financial failure and not having money. And it's interesting perspective to hear your side of the fear of failure, which is legit life or death. And it makes it in a good way. I don't say this in a bad way, but in a good way, it, like, diminishes, for me personally, the need to feel fearful, because it's like, well, at least one of the outcomes isn't me dying,
Yeah.
So it's interesting perspective to hear that from you. What was the training like? Because I've heard a lot of other folks who have gone through that, not personally, but just, like, through consuming content and whatnot, that they're like, yeah, there's most certainly a physical component, but the large majority of it is mental. Walk us through that, and maybe include any instances where you started doubting yourself, if you did, and how you worked through that. So walk us through the training portion.
Well, the training was, it was as advertised. It was pretty hard. And, I forget the numbers exactly, but, you go to boot camp and hundreds of people, maybe even over 1,000 people, right? Like, during boot camp, they they take a fitness test and all this so that they can try to go to buds to SEAL training. So I don't know that number per se, but it's, you know, it's probably over 1,000 or whatever in a period of time, right?
Mhm.
I think there are 6 buds classes a year. I'm not sure, might be more, but like just say there's 6. So a new one starts every 2 months. Let's just do that for basic math, right? Um, my buds class, we started with 187. So from boot camp, right, the hundreds or maybe even thousands that tried out, basically we started with 190 for easy math, right? And 6 months later, graduated, I think, 22 people, 19 of which were originals. So there were only 19 left from that almost 190. And then we had a couple of people roll in from other classes who are my classmates to this day. I'm just saying, I can, you know, they graduated buds with me, but we started with, you know, 190 and graduated with 19 roughly of that 190. And you know, I often talk about this. It's obviously mental, and it's physical and mental, and certainly the more fit you are, um, it will help you, right? So all things being equal, and we do a 4-mile timed run on soft sand every Monday. All things being equal, if we're both the same mentally tough, but I can just get through that run easier, then I can use some of my mental toughness later, right? Maybe during the surf torture or whatever, right? So, of course, it's helpful to be in shape, right? And it is a highly physical thing. People, I think it is more mental, but just not to, I don't want to discount the physical effort. Like every Monday morning, you do a 4-mile timed run in soft sand. Then there's a weekly timed, you have to do the obstacle course, right? This really hard obstacle course. And then there's a weekly 2-mile ocean swim, 2 miles in the ocean. And that's hard because you don't have like a line under the pool to see how to go straight, right? You're kind of swimming and looking forward and swimming, looking anyway. There's these timed events and like, and then there's the untimed things like the PT on the grinder, which is like a rough asphalt parking lot, and you know, all these things. And just like as an example, just to eat chow, right? Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, it's a 1-mile run each direction. So 3 times a day, they're running 2 miles. So you get 6 miles of running, not counting all the workouts, right? And you know, the main reason people don't make it is they quit, and that usually has to do with the cold water. But another reason people don't make it is, you know, injuries. And there's a lot of lower leg injuries and stress fractures just because of the sheer volume of work being done. So 6 miles of running to eat, right? And it's not like a timed run, you're kind of shuffling, but it's still impact, right? So anyway, back to my class. If you honestly, if you took, let's say you took a panoramic, you know, say we had iPhones back then and we could take a panoramic photo of 190 people, 187, but whatever. And we had to take our shirts off, right? And we had our running shorts, our shoes, and our shirts off. And then I handed you like this Sharpie and told you to circle the 19 people that'll make it through this training, like 6 months, you know, previous. You wouldn't have circled me, and you wouldn't have circled more than half, 3/4 of the guys who made it through, because there's like I was sizing my classmates up. I'm like, oh, that guy doesn't look like much. He ends up being one of the toughest, right? Or, oh, that guy looks like a stud. He ends up quitting right away, right? And I'll take it even a step further. You could take a spreadsheet and actually print out people's measurables, like run times, swim times, obstacle course times, how many push-ups or pull-ups or sit-ups they can do. And then like I would ask you, okay, check the 20 or so guys that you think will make it through based on their measurables, and you'd still be wrong, right? Like because there's really no way, like it's very hard to like measure heart and desire and grit and things like that without actually having the 6-month selection process, right? And the military has spent millions upon millions of dollars, with psychological studies and, health screenings and all that, just to try to figure out what makes it more likely for someone to make it through training. Because, there's never enough special operations forces. They always need to have more. And certainly there's never enough SEALs, but they're like, what makes it likely for someone to make it through training? They just haven't figured it out. So, and the answer is you can't really.
I was just going to say, what my playing the other side of that coin is, do you want to make it easy for people to get through? I mean, these are the baddest
No.
dudes on the planet that are responsible for the most high level missions. I don't think you can just give that away, right? You just gotta
No,
you
they're
gotta
not
take
trying
the
to make
guys
it
that come to
easier.
the surface. Yeah.
They're not trying to make it easier. What they're trying to do is, so let's just say it's, hardness level 100 or whatever. They're trying to determine how can they pre-screen candidates more effectively so there's a higher chance of them making it through, right?
Gotcha.
And I don't know, like, so to my class, yes, it's in the SEAL training that I went through, it was very physical, obviously, but it's mental, right? You have to, no matter how fit you are or how good of an athlete you are. It wasn't, I think it was my class or the class behind me. There was a kid, he was like the Olympic alternate decathlete, right? So literally one of the
A
best
specimen.
athletes. Yeah, physical specimen, over 200 pounds, the fastest runner, fastest swimmer, could do the most pull-ups, most sit-ups, and push-ups. Like he was literally the best at everything that we tested. And like he quit on the second day of Hell Week or something, right? And he was swimming in a whole different gene pool than me, right? So just that unwillingness to quit and that resolve to keep going, because no matter how fit you are or how good of an athlete you are, I mean, they will find a point to make you fail, right? And you're gonna fail. Like no matter what, the human body has limitations and they'll push you way past them. So you learn pretty quick that, like, the mind shuts you down before the body does. And if you can convince yourself to keep going, like, you're just surprised by how far you can go. Like, how much more you can do. For me personally, I had this like extreme. This is Wednesday, I think Wednesday of Hell Week, like right in the middle, right? So Hell Week it's not a week, it's like 5 days, but
Feels like 20.
it feels like forever. And it is kind of the pinnacle in the first phase and we're having our Hell Week, and it was like, I think it was day 3 or whatever, and I'm getting this intense flank pain, side pain, right? And I would later find out it's a kidney stone. So I have literally a kidney stone in Hell Week, which is just bad luck. And
Less than ideal.
Yeah, like, so two of the most painful things you can think of. I mean, and I wasn't smart enough to quit or whatever. I just kept going. And the for me, the hardest moment of that week was there's this thing called steel pier. And basically it's a metal pier that you run over to at night, and it's almost, in the dark of night, and they're hosing it down with water. It's almost colder than the water. So I forget the duration. It could be an hour, it could have been 5 minutes, or it could have been half the night. But you jump in the water and tread water for a period of time, which it's based on the water temp. So there's these water tables, or these temperature tables, and they know, okay, if the water's 60 degrees, the students can be in the water for 5 minutes or whatever. And then, so you tread water, and then to warm up, you jump out and you lay on the steel pier, which is coated in, they're soaking in hose water. And then you're taking your shirt off. Pretty soon you're just in like your shorts or whatever. And you're just going from very cold Pacific Ocean water in the bay, but it's still the same water, and then to the steel pier, and back and forth and back and forth. And I remember shaking so hard, and like my head just bouncing on the steel pier, and everyone's close to being hypothermic, and it's just beyond miserable. And in that, that's the moment when my kidney stone or that flank pain was the worst, right? So I made it through, and I'm like, okay, like if I could go through that, I can probably make it through most things. So that for me was definitely the hardest moment of BUDS training, which is the initial kind of SEAL training.
Similar to the situation with your father and your buddy's girlfriend at the time, the people who are running and facilitating the training, was it more of a, I'm going to prove you wrong because they were basically talking down to you the whole time, or I'm going to prove them right because they were encouraging you the whole time? My guess is that it would be the former, but like, what was that experience like?
Well, and they early on, especially first phase and parts of second phase, there's zero encouragement. It's more, you're not good enough, prove me wrong. Right.
Quit. I want you to quit. Yep.
Yep.
Ring the bell.
Yeah, I mean, you have to prove to them. I'm just, they have no idea who you are, right? So they know mathematically the more people that quit, probably the better job they did at preventing a bad teammate from joining their community, right? And they're hardcore, right? So
when you make it, are there like hugs at the end to where they're like regular humans again, or they're still like, oh, you little twerp?
Yeah. Well, you'd never really make it. That's the thing, right? So you finish BUDS. They do it differently now, but my experience was you finished BUDS, basic underwater demolition SEAL training. You're still not a SEAL, right? From there, I went to Army jump school, static line parachute school for 3 weeks. Come back from there, and now I'm a BUDS graduate who can do static line jumps, but I'm still not a Navy SEAL. And then I went through a 3-month process. It was called STT, which I think that stood for like SEAL Tactical Training. And that's where it goes from being selection to more like gentleman's course, meaning they teach you the skills you need to know to become a SEAL. So you go more in depth on, marksmanship, demolition, parachute, navigating, like comms, sat comms, maritime operations, all these things that you need to know, land warfare, small unit tactics, yada, yada, yada. So in that 3-month period, they teach you the skill, the job. And you finish that, you get a high five, but you're still not a SEAL. And then you still had to, I think we had 3 months of being like probationary, new guys at our team. I was at SEAL Team 5 at the time. And you check into a SEAL team with all that training and having proved all those people that you can do it, and you're still not a SEAL. And then finally, after a few months of being at the team, you take a we had to take a Trident board and like this really hard test. And when you pass that, then you're finally a Navy SEAL, right? Now the process is different now. Like now they go through BUDS and then SQT with all the jumping and all the stuff, and they show up at their respective SEAL teams with their Trident, and they are SEALs. But even once you're a SEAL and you've got your Trident, and that's like you've tried, like all you cared about, you finally earned that Trident. But now you're just a new guy. Like now you're like, okay,
Now you got to go earn it.
Now you're a SEAL, you're a brand new guy in a platoon, and okay, you think you've done a lot. Well, everyone here has done all of that, and we've deployed multiple times. So now you have to prove yourself to that team, right? So in my case, showed up at, team 5 and had to earn, there is kind of a phrase, you have to earn that Trident every single day. It's not just when you finish, your training, you become a SEAL, you kind of have to earn it every day. And that's true. So you're a new guy, everything you do in that first platoon and that first deployment, you work so hard to prove your worth and to be on that team. And then, you really don't feel that comfortable until like your second kind of workup and your second deployment. And you feel like, okay, now you have a little bit of confidence and whatever. And then in my case, after that, I left that team, and then I, went through a whole nother process to go to another team called Dev Group, and I made it through that training. And then I'm a brand new guy at Dev Group, right? In which case I have to, earn my, earn my spot on that roster every single day, because a lot of people want to go there. And it's not until after two or three deployments there where you finally feel like, okay, I'm, I have some confidence to walk around, and I belong here. I've heard this said, and it might have been, I don't know, like I try to pull things from other walks of life and use them, and equate them. And I don't know where I heard this, but someone once said, like, success isn't purchased, it's rented, and the rent is due every day. And that was my experience in the SEAL teams. Like, you never really arrived. Like, you got to a point where you had to, prove yourself every day and pay that rent every day. So it's a really exciting time in life, but it also, it does get pretty exhausting, right? Like when you're
imagine
always proving yourself. And then you get new guys show up. Let's say you've been there for 4 years or whatever, and you've done a few deployments, and now these new guys show up, and they're the hot shots, right? And now you're the old guy who's been there a while, and you have to show them that, you can outshoot them, or you're more tactically sound, or whatever. Even, it's harder and harder to outrun them because they're younger, but you get the point, right? It's just, it's an A-type environment, if you can imagine as A-type as possible.
That might be an understatement.
Yeah. But it's, so on the one hand, back to the paradox, right? It makes you feel like you can do anything while keeping you very humble.
Yeah.
It's
Beautiful
very
thing.
interesting. What and I'm not sure whether or not you can answer this, but I'm more curious than anything. What's the coolest piece of equipment that you had the opportunity to use while serving?
There's some really cool stuff. I don't know if I'll just talk about things that everyone already knows we use.
Yeah.
That's fine.
And that's
I figured that would be your
goggles.
response, so I'll take what I can get.
And it's nothing fancy, man, but I'm telling you, when you can, when you could, own the night, and see things before others can see them, obviously it's in your advantage. So,
Were you
that
able to
was,
smuggle a pair of night vision goggles home by chance? If so, I think I need to try them on.
I wished I could have. Yeah, they're not cheap. I saw on one of our inventory reports once, and this was back when we were still using the twin tubes, not the four.
Yep.
And I don't know, it had like an assigned value of like 15 grand or something.
Damn.
Holy
So-
shit! For one set?
For one set of nods. And there's, that was Gen 4 nods or whatever they are. Like the nods that you buy as a civilian are a lower quality, earlier generation, usually. And you're like, oh man, these are like $3,000, and you think that's crazy. But this was even in like 2008, 2009, I looked at, it was like 17 grand or something silly, right? So yeah, I couldn't.
Jeez.
I didn't leave the military. I left the military with a lot of gear, right? I have like 10 or 15 sleeping bags and some other stuff, some tactical gear and some climbing gear and some diving gear and whatever. But you don't get to keep
That wasn't one of them.
Yeah, you don't get to keep your nods, your guns, obviously, your radios, your grenades, that sort of thing.
That makes sense. And you so you were medically retired in 2010, and let me make sure I'm doing this math right. So you were in there for 12 years. You and your wife, it's Leah, right?
Yep.
You and your wife Leah have been married for 22 years. So if my math serves me correctly, you were married a lot of the time while you were in the service, correct?
Yeah.
What was that like? Because you hear a lot of stories from folks where things don't work out because they're not around. Like, how did you guys stick it through roughly 10 years of being married while you being away? How'd that play out?
I'd like to know, like, how many deployments did you do, Eric?
Yeah. So that's
the hard part, right?
Back to the question. So, I kind of think chronologically. My wife Leah and I, let's see, we got married in 2002. So this December will be our 22nd year, full year, full years. We had been dating a few months. Like, I think we started dating in like February, and then we'd been dating for a while, and then I deployed. So I deployed in August of 01, the middle of August. So literally like 3 weeks before 9/11, and we got deployed to Guam, and which is PACOM, so Pacific Command, and the plan is, we're going to go to Australia and Singapore and Thailand and Philippines, and it's going to be a jungle vacation. And kind of pre 9/11, you deployed and you trained with your counterparts in these places and just had fun, right? Well, a couple of weeks into our deployment, 9/11 happens, and a couple of weeks after that, I find myself in the desert, right? So, and that first deployment, we didn't do like any real desert missions. We were doing like more of a maritime mission, like non-compliant shipboardings. But it was cool at the time. I was a new guy and I was doing like real world missions, right? So to your question, my wife and I are dating on the first deployment, and then all subsequent deployments we were married for. So we got married in 2002, right before my second deployment. And then let's see, I think 1, 2, 3, I did 4 more. Trying to remember, but 4 more trips to Iraq or Afghanistan. Is it 4? Yeah. So that would be 6 total, and 6 deployments total. And we were married that whole time, and that the rest of that. So all of the deployments but one, we were married. And then the last 4 deployments, we had kids. So it started to get harder and harder. And, you kind of had this like very challenging experience of, being a husband and father and family man at home, and then going to Iraq or Afghanistan back then, and then like, flipping the switch, right? And going warrior mode, and then kind of coming home and trying to, shut that down and be normal around
Loving
wife.
husband, caring dad. Like, yeah, that's.
Yeah. And, I got pretty good at it. Like that became a skill, right? Just a switch I could flip. I think a couple of like crazy things that just really stood out to me were, I don't know, there was this time I came home, and I had literally been like, so the last night of a deployment, we had gotten in a gunfight, and inside of a house. So it was like in Iraq, urban setting, big building, not a huge gunfight, but a few bad guys.
Bullets were flying. Yeah.
Yeah, a few bad guys shot at us, we shot them, whatever. And I'm not trying to sound cavalier about it, but that was the job. And then, so we finished this mission, and literally, got in a gunfight and finished the mission, came back to base. Our flight out was that night. So cleaned our gear, put our gear in the boxes and everything, and finished. And, literally, I don't know, it was like that afternoon, actually. Like, so a few hours after a mission, I got on a plane, flew to Ramstein, Germany, 90 minutes to refuel, and then another 8 hours, landed in, near Virginia Beach, near Norfolk. I think it's Oceana Air Base or whatever. And, I land there, and my wife picks me up. I have 2 kids at the time, and then we go to Panera, and I'm holding, they're like 1.5 and 3 or what, I forget how old, but I'm holding both of them, and it's in the morning. So we arrived in the morning, and we're sitting in line at Panera, and people are like, I'm kind of like I'm like, whoa, this is a trip. Like, I'm 36 hours removed from a gunfight, and I'm in Panera with my wife and my 2 little kids. And I'm looking around like, well, what do you want to eat? What kind of coffee you want? Like, there's so many options, and I'm overwhelmed by the options because I had like no options overseas, right? You eat what's it for what?
You eat whatever's in the can.
Whatever is in the chow hall, and then the coffee is, whatever you're making. I'm just sitting there, and people are like starting to budge in front of me, or telling me to hurry up, and I'm just sitting there. I'm just kind of like, I had to like snap out of it for a second. But that was like a trip, right? To go from one extreme to the other so quickly. They don't do that anymore, by the way. Because of the PTSD and things, like they do, I think they mandate, even in spec ops like I was in, I think they mandate some kind of a decompression stop before you come home. So you actually spend some time, whether it's Germany or wherever, like a few days to, just kind of wind it all down before they send you home, right? And I think that was, the result of some of the psychologists and whatever. But that was a trip to me. And then another one that really stood out to me was just, I don't know, coming home, and my wife took me to Target on the way home. And she's like, go get diapers, same kind of little kids. I'm like, and I go to the diaper aisle, and there's like, I don't know, it's like 40 kinds of diapers. I have no clue like what am I supposed to buy? Like, no clue. I think she did that to me on purpose to prove to me I didn't know what was going on. But yeah, I mean, it was interesting. So going from one extreme to the next, and then when I was home, you got into this cycle. You come home from deployment, and within a few days of that, after you got all your gear put away, you can take leave. So you try to go on a vacation, and then your training starts back up. And during your training phase, you're traveling so much, and you do a few months of training, then you deploy again. So we got married in 2002. And I got medically retired at the very end of 2009. So I think like my last day in the Navy was December 31st of 2009. So, or January 1st of 2010, something like that. So like 11 and a half years total. But here I am married to Leah now from 2002 up till the end of 2009. And I have not yet spent a full month with her. So it wasn't until I got either at the end of that time or until I actually got out of the Navy and we moved to Denver. That was the first time in so many years where we spent sequentially 30 days in a row together. So
how was that?
That's wild.
It was wild. Even like at some point we were in Denver and she's like, you need to go take a trip, right? Because that was our cadence. And I don't know. I've read, I've seen that the divorce rate's really high, in the SEAL teams and special ops in general. I've heard as high as 95%. I don't know that to be true. I can say I look at photos of parties we had, when I was in Virginia Beach or even San Diego, depending on what team. And I look at photos from parties that we had, and there's obviously plenty of teammates that died, either in combat, now some by suicide. And then you have a large portion of those couples too that are divorced. So, I do say everyone likes to give me credit for what I did, but I would give most of it to Leah for, what she put up with.
Holding it down. Did you guys have like I think about when you go to deploy, right? When you train, the likelihood of you dying compared to deployment is a lot lower. Did you guys have like a ritual or routine or anything like that? Or was it like, nope, I'm going to work. Let's not make a big deal out of it. Like, what was that transition like?
Yeah, it was, like tried not, you try to, on the one hand, you don't take time for granted together, right? Because there's always in the back of your mind, like, every workup, you have parachute training. And, especially when I was at Dev Group, you go away to some unknown place in the US and do 2 weeks of like high altitude parachute training, right? And from time to time, people die doing that. Especially like nighttime, night vision, combat equipment, parachute malfunctions, things like that get pretty hairy. So, that can happen, and you try not to make a big deal about it or jinx it or whatever. But, we did, it taught us a lot of things. Like, we have become, because of things like that, like we don't really fight that much, right? Because we would like, hey, I would be home for a week or two, and then I had to leave, and like, it wasn't that we didn't disagree on things, and we would argue productively about them, but like, man, it's like life's very short. Let's not like get in a huge fight over something that's not really that important. right? And I think we've done a good job of doing that to this day. I mean, we still have our disagreements. I think we handle them really well, but we've also had so many friends, and I've had so many friends died, and she's had, so many of her friends lose a husband. And so our perspective is like, sometimes we'll see other couples argue about something. We're like, you're arguing about that? Like, you don't even know how short your life could be, right? And you're arguing about this. So we do a pretty good job of like, you talk about TBD talks about choosing your enemies wisely. I think you got to choose your fights wisely too. There are those hills you're willing to die on and really argue over, but then you have to realize like some of them are just not worth it. So I think that taught us a lot. And we had a little, of course, before I would deploy, you get some time off right before you go, maybe go visit I'd go to Iowa and visit my parents. One time I went to Omaha and visited her family out in Ginger Cove. They were living at the time. And, you have those kind of things. And then you go out to eat a few times and just get your favorite restaurants out of the way and that sort of thing. And then, go to work and fly
Put it
away.
all in a box and
Yeah.
go into warrior mode.
Very good at compartmentalizing things.
Yeah, so my wife and I's two of our closest friends. He's military, and they've got 3 awesome kids. But he's actually, I don't know if you call it deployed, but he's gone for a year right now, right? And he's in DC doing war college for school type of setting, but it still doesn't change the fact that he's missing his son's senior year, right? His 2 younger kids. But like,
Oof.
I watched them, like, how they make that decision together is, and he's deployed multiple times. His previous job, he would be gone for weeks at a time and couldn't tell her where he was going, and was basically like, here's an email. If an emergency happens, you can contact this email, but everything's phones in a Faraday bag, and everything's secret. And got a lot of respect for military wives and spouses out there, because it's not easy.
It's so hard. So yeah, I have a lot of respect for what I put her through. So
Yep.
And so we're going strong. We have 4 kids and 22 years of marriage, and we got married. We lived in San Diego at the time, and then moved to Virginia for a little over 5 years, and then 10 years in Denver, and now 4 years here in Omaha. Navy, lots of different jobs since getting out. Like I'm 45, but we've crammed a lot into the 22 years we've been married.
Sounds like it. And I do want to get into some of the stuff that you did post service and what you're doing now. But I do want to spend a little bit of time. You made mention when we connected on our call before this that training and deploying in your missions were hard. But you went as far as to say that it was harder to actually leave the SEALs than it was to join. Why'd you say that?
Yeah. It's very hard to join the teams. The training's hard to get there, hard to stay there. You had to earn it every day, all those things I've already said. And then I don't know, like at some point, and then I also mentioned I got good at kind of flipping that switch, from warrior back to husband, father, family man. And then at some point you realize,
Did that scare you at all, when you, like, the fact that you got good at that?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
Right. Like,
you don't want to, you don't want to become the monster you've been trained to fight. Right.
yeah.
And I think, I have since heard, guys like Jordan Peterson. He wasn't around back then, but he has that whole idea, of becoming the monster that you tame, or what is it, the wolf with table manners. So being capable of, you know, someone who's not capable of violence cannot say he's peaceful. They just can't do it, right? So having the ability to, protect yourself, defend others, do whatever, and not do it makes you peaceful. Anyway, that was a bit of a sidebar. So I'm like, this is kind of strange. I feel like I can pretty easily flip this switch. Because you know why it was, because I knew I could always go back and forth. I think that's part of it. I knew that, I was really happy to be home, and, but after a while I'd get kind of bored with it, and like, that's okay, because I'm going to go back to war soon. Like, or when I was on deployment, I'm like, kind of like, oh, I'm sick of the food, and I'm starting to get complacent. We've done too many missions now, and I'm starting not to take it seriously enough. It's time to go home. And that's fine, because, I'm going to go home soon. And you just kind of go back and forth, right? So at some point I realized, right after the medical retirement, I'm like, oh, I'm not going to go back over there anymore. And then I got out of the military because of that, medical retirement. And I didn't want to stay in Virginia Beach, because I didn't want to be around the guys who were still doing the job. I kind of equated it to, being a star of the high school football team as the senior, but then going back to all the football games when you're a freshman in college, kind of being around them and being like, oh, I could have done that. I could still be out there, right? I wanted to move on. So we moved to Denver. My wife had family there. I liked the mountains, all of those things. And, we're in Denver, and the thing about that made it really hard, like, number one, I left the Navy, and the Navy, even in the SEAL teams where you have so much independence and they want you to be a free thinker, they're still kind of telling you where to go and what to bring, right? You're getting orders. So it was really hard getting out, and I didn't have a job right away. I was doing consulting and working for myself. So now I'm like sitting there, like waking up in the morning and doing whatever, working out. And then it's like trying to figure out what I'm supposed to do today. Right. So that I had lost all that structure and gained all this freedom, but, and I had, discipline for days. I just didn't know what I'm supposed to be doing. Right. So it wasn't like I didn't have the willpower. I just didn't know what to do. And then, I didn't have a paying job, a regular paying job, for the first 18 months upon leaving the military. So I didn't have a steady paycheck, and I'm, doing security consulting and, personal protection stuff, and just trying to, figure it out. But I didn't have a steady way to provide for my family. So that really made me, mentally, that's exhausting, and you feel like a failure, right? So I don't have a way to, don't know what to do. I don't know how to provide for my family. I'm not like an academy graduate with a college degree who steps into a 6-figure consulting job after leaving the SEAL teams, right? I'm an enlisted guy who left the teams with very little warning, and now I have to figure things out. And then, so that was really, really hard. I also had just left, this SEAL team that I was at, Dev Group, and I was doing important work. I knew what my purpose was, right? And now I'm like, well, what am I doing now? I don't really know what I'm supposed to, not only do I not know what to do, I don't know why I'm doing it, right? And then you lose your teammates, right? And your kind of community. You have to go find a new one, and like, who's that? Who am I hanging out with? Where am I meeting people? Not in an office yet. I don't know, I don't have a team, don't have the support. And the biggest one, obviously, the hardest thing of all is losing your identity. Like for me, I had been so singularly focused on being a Navy SEAL that is who I was. If you asked me who I was back then, I was a Navy SEAL who happens to be a husband, father, Christian, American, all these things that are part of my identity. But I believed at that time, like the number one identifier was first and foremost Navy SEAL. And then,
It's gone.
Then it's gone. You don't know, right? You don't know who you are. You don't know what you're supposed to do. You don't know what's your reason for doing it and who your team is now and all these things. So yeah, I would say, I was good at being a Navy SEAL, and I made it through my training, and I made it to a pretty high level in the SEAL teams. I was always good at the job and, really good at what we had to do.
Unfortunately, war skill set doesn't always translate to the real
Yeah.
civilian world all that well.
Yeah, no one, like when I was leaving the Navy and like looking for jobs, no one was hiring snipers. So there you
So
go.
true. Yeah.
So yeah, like, oh, you need a point man and a navigator, a lead
I'm your
climber,
guy.
sniper. Like, oh, you don't need that. Like, oh man, I gotta go. So the lesson was very quick. Like, if anything I've learned, my time in the teams taught me that steep learning curves are a skill. Like I can learn quickly. So I figured out like, okay, what do I need to learn? Like I realized that not everything you learn in the teams is going to translate, at least not the hard skills. Certainly some of the soft skills like leadership, staying calm, handling stress, communicating effectively and being on a team and discipline, all these traits or soft skills that work everywhere. But I also learned like there's actual stuff that people that sit in offices like that need to know. And time to get on Google and figure that out. That's what I did. And buy some business books and figure it out, right? So steep learning curves have been probably one of the common themes in my life. I didn't see the ocean until I went to SEAL training, right? You can imagine.
That's wild.
Yeah, and I think the third or the fourth time I got on an airplane, I jumped out of it. So, because I never got on an airplane before I joined the Navy, right?
Midwest boy.
Yeah, we took vacations in Omaha from
Yeah.
Iowa, right?
Yeah.
And then, what else? Oh, so they turned me into a rock climber, because I could do more pull-ups than the other guy I was with. He became a door breacher, and my team leader's like, "You're going to be a rock climber." So, and we had a climbing component so that you could learn how to climb over walls and rocks and whatever. There's, I won't get into the why too much, but I was one of the lead climbers on my team. And so I go and I get 4 days of rock climbing at a place in Las Vegas and 4 days somewhere else. So now I have like 8 days of rock climbing on real rock to my name. 8 days. Day 9 was a training day on El Cap, and day 10 was the first day we launched up El Capitan. So the 10th time in my life that I went to go rock climbing was our first day on El Cap, right?
Which is the pinnacle for most climbers.
Yeah, it's like
one of them.
Yeah, it took us, we did it as a team. It took us 3 days to summit. So we spent 2 days in Portaledges on the side of El Cap, and then spent the third night, on top of it. But, we're not, I think, what's his name? Alex Honnold, the guy who climbed it, or Honnold, the guy who climbed it without a rope. We certainly used a rope. But I mean, the point of that whole story is like, okay, I can learn anything, right? Like, and that's one of the things you learn at high levels in the military, and especially in the SEAL teams. You're constantly you have to learn how to learn.
Survive and adapt.
Yep. And back to the fear of failure, the failure now was letting down my family, right? And not being able to buy groceries and, put gas in the car. So that, that was a good thing. Like, and it drove me to, it drove me to the next thing and to the next thing and the next thing.
Let's go through what some of those next things are. So you had gotten out while you were reading the business books and whatnot. You had made mention that, some security consulting, here and there, just getting by. But what were some of the steps to lead you to what you're doing now?
Yeah. So at one point we were consulting for a guy in Denver, and we were teaching him how to shoot. And we took him to a gun range, and that gun range would not let us work with him on doing a holster draw, so drawing a gun from a holster. And they also wouldn't let us rapid fire. So they wouldn't let us shoot more than one shot at a time at a fast pace. And most ranges back then wouldn't allow that. And I was like, well, that's a glaring issue. If you're going to buy a gun for concealed carry or self-defense, like, you have to know how to draw it out of a holster, and you have to be able to shoot, both quickly and accurately, which requires training, rapid fire. Like, these are basic things I learned in the SEAL teams that I took for granted. And I was like, well, this is kind of dumb. We can't do this at any gun range. And he was, he was a wealthy Denver businessman who could afford our, help. He's like, well, why don't you guys just go raise some money and buy your own gun range? And we're like, what? What do you mean raise money? So with his mentorship, and some help from him, and then, meeting potential investors, we raised, I think, around $2 million and bought a failing gun range, and bought it for like, 1.5 or something. I forget. I don't know. It's somewhere around there. We raised enough money to buy the facility. There was no business to speak of. Like, it was a failing business, so there's no operating company. We just bought the dirt, bought the building, bought the assets, and then we raised enough to then also do some improvements on the property, specifically around the bullet traps and the ventilation system, and really clean it up. And we didn't raise enough to, like, paint it and refloor it and all that. So we actually painted it ourselves, put in some carpet. Like, I literally put in all new outlets and toilets in this place, because, I'm a farmer, and I knew how to do basic plumbing and basic electricity. So we reopened a few months later, and, we had our own business. And I think at the high, we probably had, at some point, maybe 40 employees.
No shit.
So yeah,
yeah.
and we were rolling, and I really enjoyed that. I learned a lot in that experience. And then, I had a business partner, former teammate of mine, and he runs it to this day. At some point along the way, we kind of realized it was probably better for the company to have one leader. And as I mentioned, SEALs are a little bit A-type, and there were times when both of us had our hand on the wheel, and we're trying to pull it a different way. And I was certain that I was like, okay, it should be me to run it, and I'll put an offer together to buy him out. And then at that point, I had started to take a walk at midday, and I went on one of my daily walks, and I was, we can get into it later, but I was praying and walking. And then a friend of mine who had been a friend and mentor of mine, a guy named Pavel Satsulin, who ran a company called Strong First. which is a kettlebell and barbell it's a fitness, strength and conditioning, like education company, right? He's the guy who brought the kettlebell to America, and the reason there's a kettlebell in every gym now. Long story short, he had asked me a few months before that if I knew anyone because he was going to hire a CEO, and if I knew anyone who might be interested. And for whatever reason, while I was walking that one day, I was like, this thought popped into my mind. And I was like, oh, I'm interested. So I emailed him back, went through an interview process, and I had been at Blue Core, our gun range, for a few years, and I stepped down from the day-to-day there, and then went over and worked in the from firearms over to the fitness world, and then became the CEO of that company, which was a
Do you
lot
happen
of
to
fun.
know Bill Esch?
Mm-mm.
Kettlebell warrior here in Omaha.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, he's I think his Instagram is kettlebell warrior Landon. I think you're right on that.
I'll check him out.
Yeah,
Stud. He's been on the pod as well.
Well,
like a world champion kettlebell guy.
So there are a couple of kinds of kettlebell training. There's the competition style, and then there's the hard style, which is like slightly different. And that Pavel focuses more on the style that is, I don't know, like you'll never, it's not competitive. It's more for application to other things you do. But
Yep.
the sidebar on kettlebell training, when I was in the military, like towards I think the last 3 or 4 years of my time in the teams, I had switched my training from kind of the classic bro split, chest and tries, back and buys, legs, or days when you would do cardio and then you would do your lifting. And I just started to train a couple days a week with kettlebell, and I noticed that, like, the cool thing, I could do like my kettlebell swings or something, and I would get my cardio and my strength, and it would only take up a little space in the corner. So I really became a huge believer in kettlebell training for kind of all around functional fitness, and especially for training to be able to go do SEAL missions, or go on all the adventures I did. Like I climbed Denali and Aconcagua, and I did, a lot of the training I did was just kettlebell training. So anyway, I believed in the tool. I believed in the system. Had an opportunity. I'm always have been very passionate about kettlebell training, and I went on to work for Pavel, and I think we had a headquarters team of just under 10 people, and then a senior instructors around the world, 30 or 40 of them, and that started in 2014. I did that until 2017. And the cool thing about that was, I was building an operating system to kind of run a business, working through the people and the culture things, and the metrics and the meeting rhythm, and like kind of all those things that I think that I pulled from the book Traction, like just building an operating system. You'll see that book back here.
I saw it earlier. My mouse is right over it. You can, there it is.
I kind of did like a hybrid between Traction and Rockefeller Habits, like just kind of building like an OS. Long story short, I enjoyed it. And a really cool lesson for me was, running a geographically distributed business, like pre-Zoom. So we were using obviously cell phones, but then I'd have a conference call with 40 people. What am I going to use? Oh, GoToMeeting, right? Like back in there was a thing called GoToMeeting. I think they were the first one I can remember. But we would do these virtual call-ins, yeah, either webinars or two-way, like whatever. And I'd be presenting on GoToMeeting, and then we'd have questions. And so just kind of building a rhythm, around a meeting rhythm around that. And it was a lot of fun. And of course, I've always been, fond of strength and conditioning, fitness in general, and I was a huge believer in kettlebell training. So what an amazing time. And by the way, I do want to meet the kettlebell warrior if he's in Omaha. That sounds awesome.
He's a stud.
Yeah, I don't want to compete with him, that's for sure. Anyway,
He is shredded.
I'm sure he does too. I have a lot of mileage, so I'm not. I look maybe even 45 or younger, but my MRI looks like 65. So
That's fair.
Yeah, that was a fun time, and I learned a lot. So I went from a brick and mortar company where I had, started the business, raised money. Like, I mean, we met with potential investors and they're talking about P&Ls and forecasts and things like that. And we're leaving those meetings. We get on Google and we're searching, what is P&L, right? Like literally, like, what is that? And like, oh my gosh, we got to learn how to use this Excel if we're going to build models. And then all this kind of thing. And then I went to Strong First, and it wasn't in startup mode, but it was, maybe 2 years old. Kind of still obviously small business, and just kind of redoing the operating system, that sort of thing, and just, getting to know the people and that, and doing remote work, different industry. So from brick and mortar firearms to remote and fitness. And then from there, towards the end of Strong First, I had helped the NRA rewrite some of its training curriculum around concealed carry, shooting handguns. And that had at some point kind of led to them offering me a position there as their director of education and training. So that is, they offered to me to become the the national director of all the firearms training for the NRA. And I was like, wow, this is a really amazing opportunity to, go back.
It's a pretty sizable organization.
Yeah, go back to firearms, and really, I have the ability to impact, an organization and their training. And everyone knows the NRA for, lobbying and Second Amendment issues, which is very important. But I was working for the operation group within the NRA, not the lobbying entity. And I think when I showed up, I had roughly 15 direct reports in my office in Fairfax. And we represented and helped and supported, something like 115,000 NRA instructors in the US.
Jeez.
So it was and still is, the largest firearms instructor training group in the US. Now, not all 115,000 are like active instructors. I would say it's a percentage of those that teach a class every year. Some people just get that credential to say they're an NRA instructor or whatever. But I had, so it was a huge opportunity for me, and I did that for the next 3 years, where I was from 2017 to 2020, the director of education and training for the NRA.
And then you got into consulting after that, right? For a beverage company?
Well, I started doing some so I left the NRA in early 2020, right around the time COVID was really ramping up. There were some budget cuts there, and I was either going to have to move to Virginia or part ways with the organization. And we were living in Denver at the time, and I didn't want to move back to Virginia. My family didn't want to move. Um, we we parted ways, and I started to do consulting. There was a period of time where I was doing consulting and speaking, so that was probably by April of 2020. And then I actually first was for about, probably 7 or 8 months. I went and worked for a manufacturing company in Sacramento. So we had left Denver. We did move to Omaha, and I started to work for this company called TriTool in Sacramento. And well, north, a suburb of Sacramento. And I didn't know much about manufacturing, but they brought me there because of my background in training programs. And so I was helping them. I was a VP of training. I was helping them write training programs to train machinists. And it was an awesome opportunity at the time. I never thought I wanted that job, but it was a great job when I had it. I did that for, like I said, around 8 months or so before going to work for Defy, the beverage company. So there was a brief period there where I did that. And then I went and worked for Defy. At the time, I was working at the manufacturing company and doing some consulting for this Defy company. And then after a few months of consulting for them, they promoted me to the COO. So then I did that for 3 years. So there were these 3-year stints.
And what are you doing for the past few years or past couple of years?
Yeah, no, I started, parted ways with Defy. Well, I haven't been doing that lately. And that was in October of last year. Just kind of at a point where I'm doing consulting now. So at the moment I'm doing a mixture of consulting and advising for different size companies. I'm working right now for 3 or 4 of them, and then a fair bit of speaking as well. Just sharing my experiences learned from now actually 12 years in the military and 13 years out. So I've kind of looked at what I've learned and what works from this, what translates from the battlefield to the boardroom, so to speak, right? Because I've kind of come to find out that, yeah, it's cool to be a Navy SEAL, but that doesn't mean you know it all or you can do it all. And not everything you learn in that world even translates to the world I'm in now. And there's some similarities between business and war, but anyone who says they're the same didn't do one of those, in my opinion.
I think that should be mutually shared.
Yeah, like war is kind of ultimately a zero-sum game, right? Yep. You find the enemy, meet the enemy, and you meet on the battlefield, and one of you leaves and one of you doesn't. In business, it doesn't work that way. Like there's multiple competitors in the same industry, right? And they get their chunks of market share, right? Now there are certain attitudes, I think, and mindsets that help, but you don't get to kill your enemy in business, right? You can,
or at least you're not supposed to.
Yeah, I mean, right?
It's frowned upon.
It's not legal. It's not legal. But yeah, so now I do, consulting and speaking, essentially.
Love it. Well, and for those of you listening to this, it's very interesting to me how you had your experience in the military. You came out and you're like, which way's up? What am I doing? How do I do this stuff? raise money? What do you mean? What's a P&L? How do I use Excel? And all of the experiences that you've had since the military, there's been some transferable skill set to a degree from the military, but by and large, everything was learned. And I'd imagine books were your friend, Google was your friend, podcasts
Yeah.
were were your friends, and they probably
Yeah.
still are today. And it just goes to show that with just the diligence around consuming information and saying yes to things that you don't know how to do, but having the cojones to figure it out, you can do some really cool things. And I think Landon can attest to that too. I can attest to that as well. Like, you're a product of, the books you read, the things that you consume, and the people that you hang out with, and your willingness to say yes and just figure it out. But it doesn't, I mean, you said it yourself, essentially, focus on football during your school and not school. You spent, a year in college, while the whole time you knew you were going to go away and not complete it. So I'd imagine that a lot of what you're doing now is a result of the books that you've read and things that you've consumed since your schooling, not a product of your schooling.
Absolutely. It's a common, they say you are what you eat, right? When you're with your food. Um, and, you could just say you are what you consume, right? It's the books, the stuff you listen to, the stuff you watch, and obviously what you learn from mentors. I've had great, I think, not to be discounted, I've had really great mentors from since leaving the military. And I had great parents that raised me, to be humble and to work hard. Like the traits that I learned from my parents, um, responsibility, work ethic, all those things that I learned from both my mom and dad and from my time on the farm. More traits, less, skills or knowledge, but
Mm-hmm.
those have helped me then translate to learning from business mentors and the books and the podcasts and things like that. And then, for me, it has not been linear. Like obviously I've had a few different jobs, and if it was linear, it would have been like that on the first business, and would have sold it for hundreds of millions, and I would be talking to you as a millionaire biohacker or something like that. But I'm not, and I've learned by doing, right? Those various jobs, you learn a little bit each time. So yeah, I think lifelong learning, and just anything you do can be disrupted by someone else or something else. But as long as you have the ability to learn, then you'll figure it out.
And
Love that.
speaking of books and the impact that it has on you, so one of the questions that we ask all of our guests is a book that's had an impact on them. And when we asked you during our intake process, you picked the Bible. Talk to us about that. I'm curious to know, have you always been a man of faith? Did it come while in the military? Did it come afterwards? Walk us through that and the impact that the
Yeah.
Bible's had on you.
So I grew up going to church, and I don't remember a time in my life where I didn't believe in God and didn't believe in, Jesus, right, as my savior. So I grew up a Christian, and and my parents were awesome. So I don't have the common, sob story. I had a hard upbringing on the farm, but I had amazing parents, and I grew up going to church and all those things. Then I went to college and the military, and I was early on in the military. I certainly didn't go to church. I was just too busy, you know. Young SEAL on a Saturday night is probably in a bar and sleeping in on Sunday morning. So, and I fit that mold. And then, you know, we got married and we started to have kids. And I was like, man, it's probably important that we go to church. So we started going to church again, right? Largely for them. And that was in Virginia Beach. We found an awesome church there. And we enjoyed the sermons, we enjoyed the pastor, and it was a big part of our life there. And, you know, started to get back into my faith. And part of it too was around that time, you know, I was getting into, you know, real gunfights, seeing teammates die and things like that. So I would not only would I question why did he die and whatever, but I'd also be like, all right, like start to pray a lot and read the Bible more, and like God uses these periods of hardship to bring you closer to him, right? And so I started to pray more and started to read the Bible more, and then my wife would tell me stories like I would be on deployment and she would be at church, and you know, she would be so worried because I had just lost 3 teammates that were standing next to me and died, right? And she's like worried about it, and she'd be at church and crying, but then she'd have a feeling of peace over it, right? So we were kind of growing together through that, and going through it together in different ways. And then at some point, you know, I realized I was more faith's a big part of my life. I think when I got out of maybe my last year in the military or the first year out, I started to read the Bible for 10 to 15 minutes a day every day. And so at least for the last 10 years and probably more, I have read the Bible cover to cover every year, right? Some version of it. So, and I actually just finished the Bible, a version that I gave to my son. So I read that whole Bible and I underlined my favorite verses and handed it to him when I went to college. And then in the inscription, I said, don't wait as long as me to read this book cover to cover. And you know, he probably will, but I don't know. To me, nothing has changed my life more. And that's nothing other than daily prayer in the morning and reading the Bible. And the funny thing is, they say that it's alive. I believe that because every year, like every time I come across whatever passage, like I'm going through a different something and it just hits me differently. Right. And there are times where I'll read it and it's like, man, like last year when I read this passage, it just like it's different than this year because of what I have gone through or what I'm going through now. And
yeah, I would imagine you're a little closer to Jesus on the battlefield at times, and then that those messages are a little different than now. You're like you said, you're in a boardroom setting, right? And maybe things are frustrating and
but still, I mean, everything's I guess relative, right? I would say without question, there have been times post-military where I was more stressed than I was while I was in.
Yeah.
Because while I was in, I was
as long as you survived, everything was taken care of for you, right?
Yeah, I was younger and a little more ignorant, and I didn't worry about money and whatever, right? Like, and now you have other stresses, right? And it's all relative. You also forget how hard it was. I think there's times where, as good a perspective as I have, there are times where I forget that a bad day at work is when you lose a teammate, right? And now it's like, something goes wrong on a meeting or a call or whatever, and you think that's a bad day, right? And it really isn't, but I have to remind myself of that. So it's been, like I said, it's been a while since I've been in the military, so it's all relative. But yeah, the Bible has made the biggest impact on me, and just I would tell people, read it, a little bit of it every day, pray a little bit every day, and then get a journal and then write a few thoughts down and call me in a year and tell me how different you are, because that helped me a lot.
I love that.
Good takeaway.
I feel like we could chat with you all day. I think all three of us might be doing the pee dance underneath our desk right now, needing to go empty out. But I think for a potential part 2 at some point, or at least next time I'm in Nebraska getting together, because there's a lot that we weren't able to unpack and dive deep into with your work experience. We kind of went through a timeline, but there's probably a lot of really good lessons along the way. So I enjoyed that we spent a lot of time on your background as a Navy SEAL, but there's a lot of good takeaways from your work experience. So perhaps a part 2, but we appreciate your time and your insight today. Most importantly, we appreciate your service and the impact that you've had, not only there, but afterwards. So we appreciate it, man. Really appreciate you joining.
Yeah. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity.
Great chatting.
And thank you to Dan Allison, and also thank you to all you guys tuning in. And if you need any house projects with you need some help on that, Dan, do not reach out to me, because I'm in the same boat. You can reach out to Landon, and if it's some basic plumbing or electric work, you can reach out to Eric.
I would say it's probably not legal for me to do electric work in someone else's house. Actually,
you're just going over for a beer. What are you talking about?
You should probably reach out to Dan, because he would know who to call.
Yes, he would.
Fair point. Which is probably Landon. Although Landon doesn't mess with electrical work. I called him with a question. He's like, I'm not, no.
Yeah. Like you said, I'll dabble in my own house, but somebody else's, I'm like, yeah, no.
I get that.
Yeah, right.
All right, gentlemen. Boys. Well, we appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Take care.
Talk soon.
Who knew I would make it this far? They hated, they never believe me. Yeah, I would never drop the ball. I know I make it look easy. Yeah, Mayweather with the defense. I don't care what a critic got to say. I got them picking up the pieces.